Depending on who you get your college football news from, the ACC is either collapsing or expanding.
You are Locked On ACC, your daily podcast on the Atlantic Coast Conference. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
I didn't have this on my bingo card. The Utah Utes are now being linked to the Atlantic Coast Conference. We are Locked On ACC. Thank you so much to the everydayers for making this your first listen and your first watch each and every day. We're available free wherever you get your podcasts. We're free on YouTube. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. He's Kenton Gibbs from Locked On Wolfpack. I am Alex Donno from Locked On Canes. And we want to send out a sincere thank you on this Memorial Day to the veterans who sacrificed their lives for this country and for our freedom. My grandfather served in World War II, and thankfully for me and for my entire family, he was able to survive and get through that. Otherwise, I would not be here. And I certainly, Kenton, want to appreciate today the sacrifice made by so many to protect this great country of ours.
Absolutely. And when you think about Memorial Day, many people see this as the opening of grill season and the opening of throwing something on the grill, getting you some ribs, getting you some, depending on what region of the country you're from. But don't forget that this date is about those who've made the ultimate sacrifice, right? It's about that, and don't lose sight of that but let's talk some sports.
Yes, and we will talk on this episode about Duke defeating Florida State 16-4 for an ACC baseball championship. A lot of people think the ACC powers that be are kind of happy that Florida State lost. We will talk about the former ACC commissioner, the guy that put us in this mess that we're in right now. He's still making a ton of money from the conference despite being retired for a couple of years. But let's talk about Utah. Kenton, so this report came by a good reporter, by the way. This is not just, some blogger throwing darts at a wall. Dick Weiss is a New York Daily News columnist and a member of the National Sports Writers Hall of Fame. I don't feel like they put people in that Hall of Fame when you make a living out of just making stuff up. So there's got to be something behind this. And Dick Weiss wrote on his X account, speculation is circulating about potential shifts in college sports conferences. There is discussion about Utah possibly moving to the ACC despite its recent move to the Big 12, with some suggesting the ACC might be a better fit due to its ESPN network agreement and potential for increased TV revenue. However, skepticism exists regarding the stability and attractiveness of the ACC compared to the Big 12. Well, I guess the big question that I have is, is the ink not dry yet? Because I guess Utah's not technically been in the Big 12, so maybe if the paperwork hasn't, been faxed over, can they get out of that? Because I would figure once they're officially in the Big 12, they also have a grant of rights, Kenton. But at the same time, you've probably heard the same rumblings that I have for the past few months that apparently there's some buyer's remorse from Utah on joining the Big 12, and that's not really somewhere that they feel comfortable, although a lot of us assume they'd try to get into, maybe the Big 10. But maybe Utah does make their way over to the ACC.
Well, us in the ACC country, we're familiar with the phrase, it's all about the Utes. Apparently that's a thing now. But in all seriousness, Drake Toll was over there on Locked On Big 12 sniping our teams, sitting up here looking over at the ACC. Hey, Bick, come on down. You continue partying with your Savannah Bananas, brother, because we're just fine here at the ACC. You worry about yourself, because it seems to me that there's some trouble in paradise, Donno. And here's something that you and I have talked about off air ad nauseum that seems to get lost in all of this shuffle of who's leaving, who's staying, whatever the case may be. The ACC is on pace to make more than the Big 12.
Yeah.
No.
And a lot of people don't realize this because, yes, the ACC PR is terrible right now. We covered it on the show. But a lot of people just assume that members of the Big 12 are making a higher revenue cut than members of the ACC. That is not the case. The ACC is third, a distant third behind the SEC and Big 10. But the ACC is third. The Big 12 is fourth. So ACC members actually do make more revenue than Big 12 members.
Absolutely. And that's the thing that is so confusing to me as to where this perception is coming from. I understand that the Big 12's heavy hitters aren't leaving, but then that begs the question, who are your heavy hitters?
Oh, but hold on. The Big 12's heavy hitters literally did just leave.
That's what I'm saying. I'm confused as to why it's like, hey, you're worse than us because your heavy hitters are leaving and our heavy hitters already left. What? Oh, haha, your grass is turning brown. We've had gravel for grass over here for years. Ha ha ha.
Yeah.
I don't understand it. But I will say this. The speculation around Utah is so interesting because it does then leave that wonder in there of what's the language for that contract look like. Because we've talked a lot about how the grant of rights has you locked in and how there are teams in court right now for, hey, we're not sure what's going to happen and we're not sure what the settlement is going to be, if there's going to be a settlement, if they're going to have to pay the $500 million or wait. We're not sure. But if Utah ends up in a similar situation, that is just a whirlwind of trouble going from one conference to a new conference to where you're already trying to leave that conference before ever having competed in any varsity sport there. It seems to me that Mr. Toe may need to keep his eyes on the prize. It seems to me that the Big 12 commissioner, you eyeballing teams in the ACC so hard, it's like that guy that's always commenting on everybody else's relationship whole time. His old lady is terribly unhappy. What's going on here?
And Utah is a big fish in the Big 12, probably the biggest fish. They're predicted to win their football championship next year. They've won 2 Pac-12 championships within the past 3 years. So that would be a nice get for the ACC. Here's some more on Utah and even a couple of other schools thrown out there. This is a report from Luke Fletcher from the Rambling Roundup, and this is also relevant to what's going on right now. The ESPN and the ACC are having their look-in provision where they're kind of examining, the whole landscape of their TV deal with the ACC, and most people just assume only negative stuff is going to come out of the look-in, but maybe there's some positive stuff coming out of it. From this report from Luke Fletcher, said update on the ACC ESPN look-in. Being told that future pro rata of expansion candidates will be directly tied to the increase in the TV value that they bring to the ESPN-owned ACC network. And then he tags Oregon State, Utah, San Diego State, and USF. Now, out of those 4, I don't know if the ACC would potentially try to add more than one, but out of those 4, I strongly feel Utah is the strongest brand there right now.
Absolutely.
USF is an up and coming brand, but they're not at that level right now. Oregon State, obviously they've had some good relevant years in athletics, but they're underwater right now. Their athletic department is in the red. They're operating at a deficit right now. So obviously the ACC could be very attractive for them, not currently a member of any conference. And then the other one that they mentioned is San Diego State, which is like, it's not quite LA. I mean, you could get more Southern California eyes on you. It's not, the same thing as adding Los Angeles, but out of those 4, Utah would be the prize.
Oh, absolutely. Utah is the prettiest girl at the ball by a mile there. There's not a doubt about it. I mean, the other brands, they have very niche things that relate them to the ACC, but it's not quite the same. Like USF, obviously the Florida connection is there, with Miami being one of the southernmost parts of Florida. And of course, you've got Florida State and Tallahassee and all that good stuff. USF in Tampa is, in that, or the Tampa area rather, is in that type of deal. And their quarterback, oddly enough, is a Raleigh native. So like you have niche tie-ins to the ACC, but you don't have a ton of San Diego State, very similar thing, right? You don't have a ton of direct, like, hey, this is your connection to the ACC. This is why this directly makes sense. However, for all of the teams that aren't the prettiest girl in the ball, Oregon State, they would love to come. If they got the invite, I'm sure they'd be jumping for joy like the young man Charlie when he found the golden ticket. Like the granddad who was bedridden for all those years. And then once he found out that they were going to the factory, he said, it's time to shake, rattle, and roll, baby. So it's I'm sure Oregon State would with some of the things that they have going on financially. Utah, if they're not happy with the Big 12, and if the contract has not, if they faxed over the contract, if it doesn't start to that date and leaves them the flexibility to void it before, I'll tell you what, that could be a big deal. USF and San Diego State, they're both in smaller conferences where they're a de facto not going to be able to compete with the Power Five just by the baked-in discrepancies in their budgets and in what they're getting in their TV deals and whatnot. So 3 of those teams make a ton of sense and they would love to come on their end. But the question is, if the division of the pie is based on what you bring to the ACC, how many make sense for the ACC to bring in? And I think at the moment, the only two that I could see as feasible is USF and Utah. Now, maybe San Diego State has a big enough market. I haven't looked enough into San Diego State to adequately say whether or not they could bring that draw. But I think that USF and Utah make a ton of sense, possibly San Diego State. Oregon State is the one I wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole.
Right, yeah, for reasons that people may not realize with all that revenue stuff going on. Well, it turns out the ACC had a record revenue year last year and the biggest jump in the conference's history, but there are certain things that are on their expense list that make me open my eyes a little bit. We got to talk about the money that Swofford is still making inexplicably. And yeah, folks, we will congratulate the Duke Blue Devils for winning an ACC championship in baseball. You want to keep it locked right here. We're only getting started on this brand new episode of Locked On ACC. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. Thank you so much for making this episode of Locked On ACC your first listen and your first watch today. Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube, and now it's available on Amazon Fire TV and the free Fire TV Channels app. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with the local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows covering every league. Find Locked On Sports Today now available on the free Fire TV Channels app. Alex Donno from Locked On Canes, Kenton Gibbs from Locked On Wolfpack with you. So Kenton, pretty, relatively speaking, still very much behind the SEC and the Big Ten, but a record revenue year for the ACC. They generated $706.6 million in gross revenue, distributing an average of $44.8 million to its 14 football playing members. They are still behind with their $706 million. They're behind the Big Ten at $880 million, SEC at $852 million, and that gap is going to grow larger in the coming years with those TV deals in the Big Ten and the SEC. Right. But the ACC revenue rose 14.5% from last year. That's the biggest jump in conference history. Now, a big part of that was something that really should have happened like 2-3 years ago. I think it was last year when ACC Network finally agreed with Comcast, which is, I think the biggest carrier in the United States, if I'm not mistaken. They hadn't been on Comcast for the first 2 years. They did finally make the jump to Comcast last year. The revenue just skyrocketed up this past year, but it was a healthy financial year for the ACC.
What a shock, Donno. What a shock. I'm so confused. Donno, I was told that the ACC makes no money and that ESPN was trying to dump us off, even though they have these soccer leagues that are overseas that like 12 people domestically watch.
I'm one of them, by the way.
Oh, it's you and 10 other people with gambling habits and one other guy who does it for the love of soccer. You're a hybrid between those two groups, Donno. Yes, don't worry.
I am.
So it's so fascinating to me because, again, facts are facts. Regardless of how we feel, regardless of what perception is, facts are facts. And it's a clear fact that the ACC is seeing growth. The ACC is trending up and to the right, as they like to say in startup world and all that. It basically means you're moving either towards profitability or you're creating more profitability than there was before, which is what the ACC is doing. That's what the ACC is doing here. And I don't know why there is any argument against the idea that, hey, the ACC is doing good things. They're moving in the right direction, even with these two lawsuits. Again, ESPN has no incentive to say, hey, we're going to give up a league that is, I wouldn't say they're a cash cow for ESPN, but more or less they kind of are, because it's like,
Yeah.
we're winning this deal by a mile. You all have the short end of the stick. So I don't get the idea behind, hey, they leave, they be leaving sometime soon. But and by they be leaving, I mean the ESPN abandoning the ACC. I don't get where that's coming from. But there were a few interesting things to come out in the line item budget that the ACC are paying out of that 14% increase.
So let's take a look at that. So this was last year. The league spent more than $7.2 million on legal services. This was pointed out by Brian Murphy from WRAL. So 7.2. That number I'm sure is going to skyrocket this year because you got two. Well, I was going to say two active law, but really four or five.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, because you got to include the attorney general from the state of Florida. So you're involved in 5 lawsuits. So I'm sure that number is going to go up. But then the other thing was, this is crazy. So John Swofford, the former commissioner of the ACC, who, he cut that sweetheart deal with his son over at Raycom, which is one of the reasons why the ACC is in the situation that they're in right now. Even though he's retired, he still made more than $2.5 million last year. And that's just behind the current commissioner, Jim Phillips, who made a little more than $2.6 million. So I don't know what kind of a golden parachute is this? Did he write that like in his own deal? Did he write that into the grant of rights before he left? Like, what happened there?
The immorality of dirty foot clubbers never ceases to amaze me. The irony of this is what's hilarious, because a lot like I talked about how the story that came out that said North Carolina is so deeply, the state of North Carolina, not the university, is so intrinsically tied into the ACC that they cannot separate. The state university separating from the ACC would be foolish. It's so funny to see that the guy who has us in this mess, by and large, in Swofford, is still collecting more money than many people listening to this right now's entire family will ever touch.
Yeah.
Because is he doing anything for the conference to earn that? No. Many people say that, in fact, the conference was done a disservice by his services as the commissioner, and yet he gets a $2.5 million golden parachute. Boy, I'll tell you, I'd love to fail forward like that. If I failed forward like that in any aspect of life, I would have started off with a Mazda 6 that was so old, it was the first model after they stopped calling it the 626. All you got to do is crash a couple cars and you're going to get a Bugatti. I would love to be in a situation where it's like, oh man, I'm failing out of my communication classes. All I got to do is fail a couple more classes. I'm going to have a PhD in neuroscience. That is what we're looking at here with with Swofford being able to collect this much money when he's retired. How is this even legal? The ACC should have 6 lawsuits on their hands, because somebody should be going and saying, hey, John, get some of that money back, player. Get some of that money back. You don't need all that. Give it back. Come on. Give it here. Claw back time, because you know good and damn well you ain't earned that money. Now bring it on back.
I thought that was wild, and kudos to Brian Murphy for pointing that out, how much money Swofford is still making. These comments were made by Dennis Dodd, who's an excellent college football reporter. He was on a Notre Dame podcast, Inside ND Sports, and he was talking pretty matter-of-factly about aspects within college football realignment, mostly from an SEC perspective. But he mentioned, quote, SEC is done for now. He mentioned, by done, he means in expansion. He says SEC is done for now, done expanding. If the SEC does anything, it will be Notre Dame or UNC is what I'm told. But then he also said, quote, the ACC is not in danger of breaking up right now. That's what he said. So by right now, does he mean right now, but then June 30th, they're in danger of breaking up? Because again, Kenton, we had those doomsday reports that by June 30th, the conference will completely collapse and cease to exist. Dennis Dodd doesn't seem to share that sentiment.
I've got my cigars and my robe ready. And Donno and I don't screenshot comments often, but there's a first time for everything. There's a first time for everything. So stick around for July 1st, folks, because we may be firing up some stogies on July 1st to celebrate me and Donno not being two idiots, as everybody told us. Not being, what were we, Donno? Was it Arizona State fans? Is that what they called us? You all sound like Arizona State fans last year. Interesting how that works out. So don't worry. Donno and I got the cigar clips as well. We got them ready. We're not going to celebrate early. We just have it ready. We got to prepare just in case we turn out to know a little something about what we're talking about. Who knows?
Well, when we come back, what was the ACC? Were they openly rooting against Florida State in the baseball championship game? Someone claims to have evidence of this. We will discuss when we come back. Keep it locked right here to Locked On ACC. And thank you so much for making Locked On ACC your first listen and your first watch today. We're available free wherever you get your podcasts. We're free on YouTube. We're part of the awesome Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So Florida State, they got shellacked in the ACC championship baseball game, 16-4 at the hands of Duke. I was looking at this X post. Now, it comes from a Florida State fan. So I don't know if he was doing like strategic camera work, but it was a Florida State fan who traveled. Where did they have the champion? Was it in Charlotte?
It was in Charlotte. Yeah, it was in Charlotte.
I thought so. So Florida State fan, traveled to Charlotte to watch his team. It made an awesome run. I mean, Florida State made a great baseball run to the final game. And he sent an X post with this photo. He was at the fan shop inside of the ACC baseball tournament. So he's at the tournament. He says they were selling apparel for all of the teams invited except for Florida State. Surely this is just a coincidence, right? And he takes a picture of a wall of T-shirts. I see a Hokies shirt. I see Pitt Panthers. I see Virginia. I see North Carolina, I see Duke, I see Miami. I don't see Florida State. So I don't know if he just like didn't take a picture of the other wall, or because obviously we talk about anything that could hurt the ACC standings in these lawsuits. If they were intentionally not selling Florida State merch, obviously that would be a pretty bad look.
I'll tell you what, of all the things the ACC could have done to directly put themselves in hot water in this case, I would hope. And I'm not going to say I know, because I've said that before, and I've gotten a spanking behind it. So I would hope that the ACC is not foolish enough to do something as ignorant, as short-sighted, and as meaningless as not including Florida State merch in the bookstore or in the fan shop or whatever the case may be there. Because at the end of the day, what does it even hurt to include it? Florida State fans who want Florida State merch are going to go get Florida State merch. Why would you want to cut yourself out of getting a cut of that merch? They're going to purchase the merch anyway. It's just not going to be from you. Like, what are we doing here? I would hope the ACC is not that foolish. But if they are, I hope Florida State, pulls out, as the kids like to say, puts belt to behind for them in doing that foolishness.
Now, hold on. He just wrote a follow-up post. He says it has been alleged from some reliable sources that there was FSU merchandise available as late as Friday in the week, but is completely sold out. He says, how is that possible, though, before the weekend even starts? There has not been significant demand during the week. So listen, it also, Kenton, it may be possible that this is why Florida State need to get to the Power 2, because they're so darn popular. The T-shirts flew off the shelves the moment that the fans got in there. Maybe because I do see in the picture that he posted, I do see Clemson shirts. Clemson is also sued the ACC. So why would they exclude Florida State but not Clemson? Wouldn't really make much sense.
Your guess is as good as mine, but I will say you and I have talked a lot about the fact that Florida State is a big brand, a massive brand, one of the biggest brands in all of college sports. So naturally, a UT shirt is going to sell out before a Texas Tech shirt, with all due respect to the good folks in Lubbock. A Michigan shirt is going to sell out before a Wisconsin shirt, with all due respect to the folks in Badgerland. That's just how the game goes. And so if Florida State sold out, good for them, more power to them. But again, I would hope the ACC is not doing anything to intentionally sabotage Florida State, because you are going to have the dumbest possible thing that I have ever heard of in a lawsuit this big happen. this may be dumber than the guy, since they're now a part of ACC, dumber than the SMU guy when the check was written in his letterhead and he was like, oh, I never sent those people anything. When he could have just said, oh, I sent them some insurance papers. It would be dumber than that. So, we'll see.
Well, we're going to have a lot to get to later on this week, including, more fallout from the House versus NCAA settlement, where ACC schools stand in terms of their budgets, right? Because now everyone's going to have to budget in that 20 plus million per year starting around 2025, maybe later, but as early as 2025, you have to start revenue sharing. So where does that money come from in the budget? Do we start charging more for parking on campuses? Do we I don't know. Like, how do we maybe the ACC network keeps kicking butt and they keep increasing revenue that way? But definitely, it's a new era in college football. I want to send out a huge thank you and shout out to everybody who made Locked On ACC your first listen and your first watch today. Make sure to smash that thumbs up button, hit that like button if you're watching us on YouTube. If you listen to the audio version, make sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your pods. Make sure to follow Kenton on X at TGIF_Kenton. Follow his show, Locked On Wolfpack. He and Grayson do an awesome job. Follow me at Alex Donno on X. Follow my show, Locked On Canes. We'll talk to everybody next time on another episode of Locked On ACC, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.